Hello everyone and welcome to today's special post-election briefing. We've got lots to discuss given the fundamental shifts to the political landscape in this country that we've witnessed overnight and this morning. I'm Sian Conway-Wood. I'm Senior Managing Partner here at 181st Street. I have over a decade of experience in communications, excuse me, and climate and nature campaigning, working on issues such as ethical and sustainable fashion, plastic pollution, and green claims regulation, and I'm a former government Green Ambassador. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Lumsden-Groom, a fellow 181st Street Managing Partner who has a DSOC Sci in Socio-Political Economics and Rhetoric from the London School of Economics. Andrew specialises in demographic targeting and behavioural science-driven campaigns. His policy experience includes free school meals and pensions auto-enrolment, and he has previously done work for the Labour Party, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, as well as Obama in the USA on election campaigns all around the world, and has never worked on a losing campaign anywhere in the world. Welcome, Andrew. Just a quick note before we start that you can leave questions for us as we're going through in the comments wherever you're watching this live stream, and we will answer them at the end. And please do leave your questions and comments.
Hello. Right, hello all. So, welcome to a rundown of what's happening next, I suppose. So, where to start? I think there are some uncomfortable truths that as campaigners we need to be aware of, and also in terms of planning out our own strategies over the next few months and years for that matter. I think the first one of those is that I know many of us will be happy to see a Labour victory, but Labour did not win this election. And this is really important from a campaigning perspective. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Keir Starmer has a right to be in number 10, but they didn't win the election. The right wing lost the election. And that's a really important juxtaposition when campaigning, because it's key to how Labour behaves next and how it behaves over the next 5 years. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that Labour's vote share was only 2% increased compared to 2019. The 1.6 it says here was from a few hours ago. It's looking more like 1.8. But what that means is that Labour didn't convince the British public to vote for them. Instead, the Conservative vote has halved between two parties. Now, this, again, is really important to understand because for Labour to win the next election, and I know it's ridiculous to be talking about the next election when results were still coming in at 5 o'clock in the morning today. But from the get-go, Labour is going to have to plan to win, because fundamentally they didn't get a majority of people to support them this time round. What actually happened was, as you can see from the graph on this slide, you can see that the Conservative vote went down by 19.9% and the Reform vote went up by 12.3%. That's particularly interesting because that split is relatively temporary and it can't be assured long term. When Reform voters realise that a vote for Reform is a win for Labour, they are likely, if past precedence is correct, if you look at UKIP and you look at some of the other smaller parties, they are likely to return to the Conservative Party. So the strategists I talked to this morning from both the Labour Party, the Liberals and the Conservatives are all roughly saying the same thing, especially within Labour and the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberals, that they've managed, the split in the vote has allowed them to do very well in places that they statistically shouldn't be doing well in, including, as we know, very safe seats. I noticed earlier that Penny Mordaunt has lost her seat, and she would have been the primary front runner to be the next Conservative leader of the opposition. And Ian Duncan Smith has gone as well. So a number of very large Tory cabinet ministers have disappeared. because of the split in the vote, very safe majorities have suddenly disappeared. There are two options for for the Conservatives and for Reform. That is some sort of deal or merger, or over 5 years, we see the vote return to the Conservative Party. They are the two most likely outcomes. As a result of that, Labour strategists we're talking to are saying they are now planning for the next election already. They're already trying to work out how they convince enough people that they can continue their majority without losing a significant proportion and ensure that they're around for more than 5 years. Why are they thinking about that on the day that the election result is called? Hours after, well, some of these conversations we had this morning were before Keir Starmer walked into number 10. And if you did watch that, if you watched his speech outside number 10, you will feel very familiar as we go through this, because a lot of what he said is directly reflected in this document. This presentation was created in advance of him speaking, and it's not surprising that he's talking about convincing every voter that the world has got better for them, that their pockets have got better, that housing is affordable, etc., etc. So to that end, now that we've established the split, and you can see that data is directly from the BBC, and comparative polling from YouGov and from UK Polling Report all says the same thing, that the vote was split. We also saw that in Scotland. The only safe seats the Tories had were the ones where the next largest party was the SNP, and there was an exception to that, which was Morayshire and Aberdeenshire, where the leader of the Scottish Conservatives stepped down. So bearing all that in mind, let's go on to the next slide. So how the Labour Party won, as I said a few moments ago, is key to the way in which we look at the next steps, and specifically key, and I want to reinforce this as often as possible, specifically key to how the Labour Party plans to stay in power, which means it's specifically key to how the Labour Party plans out its policy and how it engages with spending money and how it engages with raising money. In other words, all policy is now about getting re-elected in 5 years' time. And if you haven't seen Keir Starmer's stump speech, let me try that again, Keir Starmer's stump speech outside number 10, I highly recommend watching that, because after this webinar, because it will align with what you're about to hear and what you are hearing for that matter. So, and I need the previous one, sorry. So just to reinforce that in terms of confirming what I've just said, because we don't take anything for granted, you don't have to take my word for it. Again, these numbers are from the BBC and cross-referenced against both UK Polling Report and YouGov, and the opinion polling, which was actually bob on this time. Well done, opinion. The combined vote for Conservative and Reform was 38%. Labour's vote was 33.8, Liberal Democrats 12.2, Greens 6.2. So even if you add Labour and the Greens, you're still very, very tight as to who would win. That is the thing that is going to be the core of how the strategists plan out, and the ministers and secretaries of state plan out their policy over the next 5 years, is how do we actually move a proportion of that Conservative and Reform vote to Labour. If they can move 10% of that, they'll be in power for 20 years. If they don't, it will be a 5-year term, and that will be it. So what does that mean? It means Labour will be prioritising building and securing the voter base from day one in all senses. That means every single policy will be about securing voters from the Conservatives, and to some extent from Reform. And we saw that again in Starmer's stump speech outside number 10. We saw him specifically reference improving the lives of deprived communities in a number of different ways. There are a number of deprived community references in there and a lot of working class references. That's C2DE on the NRS scale. As a result, all policy over the next 5 years will be targeted at securing that majority and talking to converting working class C2DE, C1, C2DE voters. Can we go on, please? So Labour's strategy in the next 5 years. Well, I've just said it. Labour has to win votes to stay in power. One strategy. We're hearing it from all the strategists, from all the SPADs. Everybody we're talking to is saying exactly the same thing. We can't talk to everybody, but our contacts are telling us quite reliably there is one strategy: convert Conservative and Reform voters to Labour. This means prioritising what they need and what they want. How do they do this? They make people feel richer. They make the economy tangibly work for the average voter. They create tangible economic and educational opportunities in deprived communities and across the country as a whole. They show clear and competent leadership. They address the issues that caused people to vote for it's been shortened to B, fabulous, for Brexit as a protest vote against the establishment. I mean, the fact is it's considered a dirty word on the left and the right at this point in time. We didn't see it massively talked about in the election, even though Alistair Campbell and I can never remember his name, Rory Stewart. Sorry, Rory. Both Campbell and Stewart talked at length about the fact it is a dividing line and just didn't really pop up at this election. Even with the Liberal Democrats, who are the only party that have very clearly said we're going back in, even they lowered their tone on that. As a result of that, the Labour Party has to address the underlying issues. When we look at the core data around Brexit, and I won't get too far into Brexit because obviously it's election day, but when we look at the core issues and we look at why the Reform voters increased so drastically and why they're winning MPs, it's the same issues in the same places. It's the same deprived communities. It's the same lack of opportunity. It's the same lack of housing. It's the fact that the average 35-year-old can't afford to buy a house in this country. So those things have to be addressed. The same causality exists between the two. And yes, I'm fully aware that what's the old joke? Misunderstanding the connection between misunderstanding that causality and correlation are two different things is how you end up walking off a cliff. Anyway, sorry, wandering off. Anyway, that has to be addressed one way or another. And in the process of addressing that, effectively, the other issues are at the core. Fix health and social care and actually allow families to pass on wealth from generation to generation. That has to be done somehow when they're going to have to find a way to cap social care costs. And apparently you can't do that through national insurance because everybody says, no, that's a terrible idea, and then doesn't come up with a better idea. Can anybody tell that that's cost me money? So do this without spending any money because there isn't any. It's the final point. The Labour Party have very clearly spent everything that is allowed to be spent and costed. When I say spent, what I mean is that the manifesto has been costed in such a way as to account for every penny that is available, and on top of that, factor in growth. So there is a reliance that the UK economy grows and results in greater tax take to the Treasury for the Labour Party to meet what's even in the manifesto, let alone any further policy that, as campaigners, we would like them to do. So that is a key factor. This strategy that Labour is going to have to pursue to convince Conservative and Reform voters, especially working class Conservative and Reform voters that should really belong to the Labour Party and have not come home even with Keir Starmer as leader, has to be achieved without spending beyond allowances. Next slide, please. So how do Labour do that? How do they manage to achieve those asks and those goals while still running the country and still winning votes? Well, that breaks down into three fundamental pillars. Three fundamental peers. That's a different type of politics. So economic benefits are the first pillar always. They're going to have to be, the fact is inflation's been too high for too long. The totality of what that's actually cost people in their pockets, somewhere between 11 and 50% of their income, comparative to 5 years ago. So it's not insignificant. It's quite a major thing. That means breaking that down into two forms, and that's the second pillar and the first pillar combined. So economic benefit is your community benefit. It's giving councils more money. It's allowing councils to provide the services that need to be provided. It's making sure your bins are collected. It's making sure there are jobs, that there is good education, and that there's opportunity for all, and that the system works to protect the individual, and that the individual can thrive within the democratic system of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, etc. So economic benefit is about communities. It's about the regions. It's about your local community. It's about whether your potholes get filled in. It's about whether or not you feel like the pub is busy on a Friday night. Never underestimate the economic theory around how many people drink beer, honestly. From there, wallet benefit. That is the other one. The other primary is make people feel it in their pocket. If in 5 years' time the Labour Party cannot make the average voter feel like there's money in their pocket, they will lose the next election. It is that simple. There's very little they can do in inflation because it's all supply push or supply pull. So very little of it is within the control of the Labour Party. The one area that is in control is energy bills, and there is policy there already. But don't mistake that for environmental policy. That is about bringing down bills first and foremost. The environmental aspect is secondary to those bills, and bringing down those bills for the average voter. That is important because as we move on, you'll see a theme in where the Labour Party is likely to position itself in government. So economic benefit to your community, especially B, C1, C2, D and E on the NRS scales. So basically everybody that can't afford a cleaner is the best way to put that, which is roughly the definition that Keir Starmer gave the other day when he was asked what a working person looked like. Wallet benefits are more specific. That is the same category, but that is about, do you feel like you can go out for dinner, if you're a family, can you afford to pay to go out for dinner, pay for the cab, pay for a couple of drinks, not anything special, and then on top of that, pay for a babysitter. If you can't do that, then fundamentally the Labour Party has failed. That is where they are. That is why that wallet benefit is so important, because if you can't do something as simple as that once a month, then this country isn't working for you. That's what Starmer said I am paraphrasing, obviously, but it's roughly what he implied on the stump outside of number 10, and it's what he's implied throughout this election campaign. So then finally, opportunity benefit. The gulf between state education, private education, whatever you want to call it, and the gulf between equality of opportunity at birth and the ability to go to a good primary school, go to a good secondary school, and then get into a university and actually be able to better yourself compared to the previous generation, is the biggest it's been in 40 years. And it's no joke. That is something that, especially around those working class voters that should go back to the Labour Party and should have voted for the Labour Party. I spoke to a colleague this morning who was distraught that the Labour Party had only managed a 1.6% increase in the vote share, because fundamentally that means those working class people in the red wall did not come back to the Labour Party. Some of them did, and there are slight red wall bumps, obviously, but in totality across the country, those working class voters that put Boris Johnson in power did not come back to the Labour Party. And the only way the Labour Party convinced them to do that is opportunity, more money in the pocket, and your local community improving. And we've heard that repeatedly throughout today and last night, as you can see from this space. Next slide, please. So what do voters care about? I mean, many of you listening will have seen our reports and the fact that we've been driving at this for nearly 18 months and saying that these issues and being specific about economic benefit to society, those three core points that we've just talked about, we've been banging that drum for 18 months to all of our clients and anybody who'll listen. And we are seeing that actually happen in real time from the Prime Minister himself. So what do voters care about? 49% of all voters consider the economy to be a top 3 priority. 44% of all voters consider health to be a top priority. That's the NHS, that's social care, that's the entire system for looking after people. Then from there, immigration and asylum, that tends towards the more right wing. You see that number drop from 41% down to about 30 there or thereabouts, 28 to 32 on the left. But again, if Labour want to win at the next election, which at the end of the day is what government tries to do, please voters to get re-elected. So immigration and asylum, and you'll have heard Keir Starmer say secure our borders in his speech. And if you haven't, I'd recommend watching that. Crime and antisocial behaviour. Crime always polls somewhere around 20%. But what's particularly interesting is housing is polling at 24% and the environment is polling at 21%. So it's not even in the top 5 of voters' top 3 priorities. That is important because that takes it off the list in its current form of let's campaign to spend a load of money to fix a problem isn't going to work. The way the environmental sector and the nature sector has been campaigning over the last 5, 10, 15 years has been we need to do this to save the planet. Those arguments are not going to wash with a Labour Party that wants to get re-elected and who has been elected because of a split in the right-wing vote, not because people voted for them en masse. So, and again, earlier, for those joining us late, we went through the evidence for that, and the Labour Party's actual vote share has only increased by 1.6% comparative to 2019, and we've seen the lowest total turnout, which I think was 60.5. I'm looking at our team on the screen to make sure that's right, which makes it one of the lowest voter turnouts since 1885. I would remind everybody that that was before women could vote. So those facts are fixed and true. And also, for that matter, before men that didn't own vast quantities of land could vote. So next slide, please. What that all means is what voters care about is going to be absolutely central. The environment and climate change is at its lowest level of support in 5 years. That means it is not going to be fundamentally a priority for this Labour government. No matter what Ed Miliband says, we haven't had it confirmed, but numerous sources have suggested he will be the next DNES, I think it is, Department of Net Zero and Energy Security. I'm sure the Labour Party will change the name of that in the next hour or so to something we can all actually remember. But it'll probably go back to being the Department for the Environment and Rural Affairs, and Labour likes to name things that actually are things. Anyway, sorry, tendency to wander off. Haven't slept, sorry. So what do voters care about? Pushing environmental messaging won't create that actionable policy change. We've got to start focusing on the core voter issues. Labour want to get re-elected. The best thing we can do as campaigners is help them do that. Fundamentally, we need to help them speak the language that needs to be spoken for them to continue their majority. In doing so, we will increase our access, we will increase what gets done, and fundamentally, if we don't, unless something changes, it will not be a priority for this government, which means no parliamentary time, no budget, no policies, no real change. And I've just realised why this slide is in here, because it's that line. Unless we start talking a language specifically around cost, benefit to communities, to people's wallets, and to opportunities for the individual and families, of all shapes and sizes, the Labour Party is not going to prioritise spending money on we must do this to save the planet. They're going to prioritise where they put their money specifically on those places that will get them re-elected. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for campaigners? I mean, this is what you're really here for. Your policy asks need to change fundamentally as of 05/19 this morning. The way we ask and the way we campaign fundamentally changed. There is limited money. It's not the first time any of us have heard that, but there is now very clearly a concentration on improving the lives of working people, which means we have to make those policies relevant to those people. That means making economic arguments. All policy asks that you put out need to have an assurance that they're revenue neutral or revenue positive. The Labour manifesto exceeds, I've said this earlier, I'll say it again, it exceeds the budget capacities, including accounting for 5 years worth of growth. That means that any extra spending has to come from somewhere, and that requires funding, which is taxation or cuts. The Labour Party doesn't want to do either of those. The one of the few Tory messages I fundamentally agreed with was the fact that in all likelihood council tax will rise quite considerably because councils are so gigantically underfunded as a result of the Localism Act that they need more funding, and it cannot come from central government because there isn't any money to pay for it. So council tax bills will have to rise, which is the one exception Labour has pointed out to its effectively no rises in VAT, no rises in income tax, no income tax, no VAT. A little bit Del Boy style there. So as a result of that, every policy needs to be costed. There are great examples of this in the mental health sector. There's great examples of this in the homelessness sector, where both of them got private members' bills through and changed government policy. I mean, in the homelessness sector, the changes to government policy were actually adopted by the government. The government treated it like it was government legislation. And again, free school meals. I worked on free school meals, as Sian mentioned. That was an economic argument. It wasn't a let's feed kids argument. It was a, if we feed kids, they get smarter, they make more money, they pay more taxes. And at the time, the Liberals were very, very keen on it from a let's feed hungry kids, but the Treasury bought into it. The Treasury officials bought into it because fundamentally, long term, it was good for the country. So being able to price those in, being able to prove the revenue positive. And if you can't prove their revenue positive, then we need to be proving that there is no cost to the average voter, because there are lots of places that you can stealth tax, and there's lots of places that the Conservatives, the Labour Party before them, the Tories before them, the Labour Party before them have all used stealth taxes over the years. But what you have to be careful with there is that wherever you tax to find your revenue, wherever you try to find a way to make your policy viable, you have to ensure that that is not going to be passed on to the average voter, the average consumer, because Labour, as we've discussed earlier, the core of Labour's mission is to put pounds in the pockets of working people and to make them feel wealthier. The daft thing is, in 5 years' time, they don't actually have to be wealthier, they have to feel wealthier. I would remind those old enough to remember of Champagne Socialism and Cool Britannia as a perfect example of feeling wealthier without actually necessarily at that point in time being wealthier. So the Labour Party has been very clear. No new major taxes other than council tax, and business taxes are too high. That means that new funding has to come from indirect taxation, otherwise known as stealth taxes, and that means that things like the plastic bag tax, corporate levies like the oil profits tax, finding ways to make it work within existing budgets, or finding ways to raise the money without direct taxation on the individual or passing that on to the end consumer is going to be key. proving this is going to be the easiest way, proving one of these two is going to be the easiest way to get your policy through. And it's going to make a lot of work for policy wonks across the spectrum, if we're honest. But let's be honest too, charities are small, campaigning organizations are small. There aren't that many donations out there right now. But spending the time and energy, even just putting together the basics of what that looks like, will get your policy listened to. You're not going to get through the door anymore with, let's give a pay rise to nature, for example. It's a great campaign. I highly support 0 Hour. We know them well. Brilliant team. Support the work of WWF and the RSPB. But at the same time, it's too vague, too indistinct, and doesn't actually say what it needs to do. And the underlying doubling of farm subsidies for nature isn't big enough to work and have the impact that is required. So finding a way to show the benefit of that is going to be key. Being able to show how every policy actually produces income for the government, or doesn't cost them anything, or saves them money in the future, is going to be the best way to prove net zero and to prove climate and nature policy works and get it approved and get it into legislation. It's worth remembering here that the Labour Party's current climate and nature policies are basically, we're going to build Great British Energy, which boils down to, we're going to give a load of money to the national grid so they can actually afford to connect the stuff that's actually already being built or licensed already. So that is the thing. There is a clear, distinct link for GB Energy that they invest in that. It creates clean power that is cheaper than importing or cheaper than running on gas, etc. And as a result of that, investing results in lower bills for the individual working family. There's a direct link there. It's a perfect example of what policy needs to look like to get into the manifesto. And I'd remind everybody that the original Labour policy was, let's spend 28 billion quid improving the UK economy, but they couldn't be precise as to how to do that. So that got stripped out and it got replaced by a very clear mathematical equation. We get more zero carbon alternatives onto the grid, and as a result of that, we get the grid to a position where we have domestic cheap energy that can then be lowering bills at the same time as reaching net zero. But it's that bills bit that made it part of the manifesto. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for your campaigners? Your policy asks need to change. Again, spending on necessities. If your policy ask requires spending, you must show a significant social and community impact. If you can't do either of the two that we've just talked about, then you have to show how it works for the community or how it's going to benefit society in the local and regional areas. I had a great conversation with one of the climate lobby. Well, actually, we had a great conversation with the climate lobby board the other day, and there was general consensus across the board that proving that it has a regional and localized impact, may that be through the building thing. I'm trying to remember what it's called, and I'm praying. Just realised my team doesn't actually have a way to talk to me right now. I'm supposed to be wearing an earpiece and I'm not. Biodiversity net gain. I don't know if anybody heard that being. So biodiversity net gain credits from Elliot Code talking about that the other day, to Nye Gordon talking about how regional investment structures work and how there's likely to be a prioritization of that. There are and also obviously Alex Birtles talking about the ins and outs of the Labour Party as well. I think it's very, very clear that from a perspective of either find a way to raise the money, find a way to make it revenue neutral, and if you can't do either of those, community and regional impact. A great example of that is fisheries. if you are talking about saving the oceans, let's talk about fishing communities. Let's talk about the deprived communities on the edge of Scotland, in the northeast of England, in Wales, and where I am right now after a very, very long night in London. Hastings and Rye, that has the biggest onshore fishing fleet of small independent boats in Europe. And it's all caught sustainably. Working to protect those communities will buy you local support, and that will get you in to talk to ministers of state. And if you cannot make it revenue neutral or revenue positive, working at that local and regional level to affect communities is going to be key. Again, Starmer said this. I know there are undertones of it in his number 10 stump speech today, but he has said that making those communities feel more valued, making working people feel more valued and like they can afford to live in this country is a start. That is where we have to start. It's going to be a slow process, but those communities are going to be key. And those communities are the ones that were left behind. They're the ones that voted for Brexit. They're the ones that voted for reform. They're the ones that Labour has to convince, while it prays that the Tories and Reform don't get together and make some sort of pact. So where spending is unavoidable, prove direct impact on voters' wallets, local economy, or the fact it creates jobs and opportunities, and be specific with what that looks like. There is predictable forecasting for this, so use it. And if you don't have it, get in touch with us through the Climate Lobby or through 181st Street. We are here to support you for that sort of thing. But finally, jobs and growth and tax take. The Treasury is king. I'm sure there are many of you listening to this right now who will have heard the phrase Treasury man. One of the Climate Lobby board members, Lucy Johnson, was saying to me the other day that the Treasury man is an interesting proposition. The idea, it's a government phrase, and it basically means that most people that work in the Treasury of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Exchequer itself believe that the Treasury's job is not to spend money, it's to save as much money as possible. It is not the Treasury's job, according to them, to invest in Britain. And that thinking has been stable for 30 years. Breaking that thinking is going to be one of the largest challenges that the Labour government faces, especially considering the current economic climate. And it's going to be very hard for the Labour Party to do that against the Treasury and the civil service. So we have to help them. We have to try and ensure that the tax take doesn't go down for the government, because if it does, there's a problem. Labour has forecast spending in such a way that the economy has to grow for it to be able to afford to do everything at once. And that's everything it's already announced, let alone actually introducing some climate and nature policy beyond GB energy. So based on all of that, we have to help them. We have to look at how the policies are paid for and how we can help the government raise that money to pay for them and prove that necessity works. So, for example, one example that I was talking about the other day was peat wetlands. There's a charity that one of my juniors was telling me about that is trying to increase the number of acres of peat wetlands. One of the ways to do that right now is to say, right, okay, we want 100,000 acres of peat wetlands. Let's use that as flood defences. Let's prove that it's financially viable to use that instead of building concrete walls. And in doing so, instead of fighting the government, tell the government that there is a way of doing this that works. I mean, these are, in the case of peat wetlands, for example, there is established data around the Norfolk Broads, etc., and plenty of data out of Scotland around the value of peat wetlands for that purpose. And as a result, don't fight for new legislation. Don't fight for a giant bill that the government then has to pass. Get into the department and say to them, this is an alternative. And I'm trying to think of the guy at Planet Mark, is absolutely fabulous. Andrew, he's running the thing. He's actually stood in Parliament Square right now. And we were talking about this the other day, that actually a lot of these changes can be done with devolved legislation. It can be done within the power of, sorry, Andrew, I can't remember your last name. My apologies. Andrew Griffiths, as you heard my wonderful team telling me as we're talking. Andrew Griffiths was talking about the fact that devolved legislation, getting the regulations right, working within the existing system, and coming together as a group, like the homelessness sector, like the mental health sector, together for a very clear set of asks where the entire sector supports it and is very, very clear as to what those asks are. No generalization, lots of proof. And then asking the government to change a small thing of what it does. Change a small thing here, a small thing there, a small thing there, because those things are achievable and actionable near instantly. If we can move to that model, the Labour Party will buy that. It will buy peat wetlands being used as flood defences. It will approve those schemes. It will allow us to move. And yes, we can still have the big pay rise for nature, but we need to break that down into clear policy that fundamentally the government can action from the moment it reads. And then finally, and I don't know if this is the last slide or if there's another slide. Finally, what to do right now, because right now there are limited things we can do. Parliament isn't called until the 15th, and then I don't know how many people will know this, but those of you who we talk to regularly will know that every MP gets a maiden speech. It will take nearly a year for possibly two, for every MP to be able to give their maiden speech. But on the flip side of that, there is now a period where the whips don't have control. For those of you who don't follow politics particularly closely, the whips decide what gets voted on and how most MPs vote. Most MPs don't get to choose what they vote for. There's a one-line whip, which is turn up if you can. There's a two-line whip that is this must pass. And then there's a three-line whip, which is we will come and find you and drag you into the Commons. So the whips control the party, and the whips are going to have to enforce Keir Starmer's will on all of those MPs and departmental will on all of those MPs, where most of them are brand new. What is it? It's like 215 of them are brand new. That is going to be a huge responsibility. And there's going to be a period where the whips don't have control, probably quite a long period. So start booking in meetings now. Get into the constituencies. Try and make constituency appointments as early as possible. There is a case where you may not be able to. Certain MPs will refuse to do that before they've been sworn in, which is expected right now to take 98 hours just to swear in the new MPs, which is just fabulous. And currently the parliamentary estate staff are running around working out how they even do that. Bless them, and spare a thought for the civil servants in Parliament who are going to have to actually make government happen when over half of all MPs have just changed, and 215 brand new MPs for the Labour Party for the sitting government. So anyway, long and short, this is the opportunity. Get your message out there to those MPs that have just won, of all parties. Take every advantage you can. This will sound utterly ridiculous. This is a good opportunity to get opposition on MPs on board, especially the Conservative Party. The reason for that being that they desperately have to change what they're doing, or they're going to lose their seats at the next general election. Something has to change on the right as well as the left. The Labour's got 5 years to get this right. If the Conservatives don't start tomorrow, then nothing's going to happen for them. So get in front of them, email them today, get in front of them, send them letters, get into those constituency meetings as soon as they're available, build a relationship so that you can then push policy later on, but get on their list before the whips stop them putting you on their list. Take the opportunity of, I hate to say it, but naive people who do not know how the political system works yet. It's an incredible learning curve. It will take nearly 3 weeks, probably a month for all MPs to be issued offices, let alone anything else. So, and at the last election, I had an MP friend who spent a year and a half without a printer because nobody got round to authorising him a printer. So we had to write everything down. The system is more broken in terms of actually how Parliament works than anybody would honestly believe. Anyway, beside the point. Point being, this is the opportunity. The system isn't perfect. If you're campaigning, now is the opportunity to get in there and start building these relationships with those new MPs at constituency level. And finally, there's lots of talk of climate and nature in the election campaign, but very few firm policies for Labour. Labour is going to desperately need the support of the climate and nature sector to work out how to do this. And that does not mean big grandiose plans. It means being specific with actionable policy, because right now, if you have the contact book, in the next few hours, unless something massive changes, it's likely that Ed Miliband is going to sit down tomorrow morning in the Department for the Environment and whatever else words they've added to the end of it, and basically say, right, okay, GB Energy, civil service, you've been told to do this. It's already been sorted in the pre-campaigning period. I want this in the King's speech. What does he then do next? We've got to tell him what he does next. He's got what he wants to do, but we've got to help him get there. He's going to be so important for this sector over the next few years. So let's help him get it right. Let's lose the marches and petitions that build public support. We have public support, it's like 80-odd%. So let's get it top level. When you start digging into that, as we proved earlier, it doesn't actually look like that. And there are blogs available that show you how that math works out. So I won't go into that again. But let's get in there. Let's actually give actionable insight and actionable policy that really does allow the government just to read it, hand it to the civil servants and go, this won't cost us money. Go check, it won't cost us money. Let's do it. Because right now the Labour Party doesn't have it. Right, that's everything from me. I want to apologise if I've waffled quite a lot.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. Really, really great overview there of the lay of the land and what we need to do next. I certainly want to dig in with some questions, and I'm sure our viewers will as well. So if you do have questions, you can put them in the comments and we will come to them. One of the things that I am really interested in, Andrew, is around the framing of the narrative. Obviously, being on the communication side of this, I talk about that day in, day out. I just had a quick look while you were talking, and our first opinion piece that we put out was actually July last year, which was how to just stop oil and win an election. And in that piece, what we were looking at was how to frame the argument around phasing out oil and gas developments and really make sure that we are protecting jobs, that we are creating opportunities for innovation, and that we are putting that in economic terms. And I know sometimes this sector really struggles to do that, partly because we are so ideology driven, and actually within the echo chamber there's this belief that it's the morally correct thing to do, that it's a no-brainer, that no matter what it costs we should be prioritizing it. And then what happens is that people get involved in things like marches. We saw the Restore Nature Now march a couple of weeks ago. And it's another opportunity to go and engage with the echo chamber, to kind of fill up your own cup, if you would like, and connect with people that share the same views as you. But the danger of only taking that action is that you're not getting out of that echo chamber. You're not learning how to frame that argument in a way that makes political and economic sense. And that stops you getting cut through. And we do see a lot of campaigning organisations get stuck in that trap, just again and again and again, reiterating the climate and nature benefits or the 10 years from now benefits, but not actually making it relevant to voters today and in the context of everything you've been saying. One of the issues that we've talked about at length and have advised clients around was obviously the ban around various elements of single-use plastic, but also the plastic bag tax. And I think there's a really interesting, and we did write about this, I'll share the link in the comments, that there's a really interesting kind of discussion to be had there around when the government bans things like single-use vapes and when they choose to tax things like plastic bags and why they make those decisions. And if we as campaigners can understand the decisions that government makes and why they make them, we can learn to frame our arguments. So I wondered if you would just walk us through, there's a really nice analogy you use around the plastic bag tax and the sugar tax, and just walk us through some of the thinking of that as a really practical example of how we can make the economic arguments.
I definitely can. That's not a problem. What I would say first, though, is please do ask questions. If you just put them on LinkedIn or Twitter, they'll pop up and we can put them on screen, mainly for no other reason, so that we can try the technology and it can actually exist, because it's funky. Anyway, sorry. So, in terms of both the sugar tax and the plastic bag tax, they are behavioural taxation, and they are attempting to stop a negative behavior by creating a cost benefit analysis in everybody's heads. People don't mind saving money. They don't really care about saving 20p because they've given out a coffee cup or because they've not used a bag. They care that it costs them more as a result of having to take that action. It's a loss aversion, effectively, and Richard, it's Richard, isn't it? Robert Richard won the Nobel Prize for it, because fundamentally it's the basis of behavioral economics and behavioral theory, is that with the sugar tax, for example, you make the economic argument that sugar is bad. So what we do is we tax the sugar in the drink, but we give long enough period to the industry to evolve. So we're saying to industry, this is going to happen, but it's going to take, we're going to give you plenty of time. And as a result, the industry just removed the sugar from the drinks. Why was the sugar tax introduced? It wasn't to lower sugar in drinks. The government doesn't care about that. It cares that sugar is bad for you, and therefore it's primarily bad for the NHS budget. And so at that point, the government is saying, we're going to tax this bad behavior to allow for health improvements for a start, because hopefully we'll lower the amount of sugar, and we'll save money in the NHS by having to treat fewer people for things like diabetes, etc., gout, for example. But on the flip side of that, there's also the argument that it raises revenue. It's a solution to a health problem that also raises revenue. It's a perfect example of a revenue positive scheme. It was originally forecast to make 2.5 billion a year in taxation, but because it was done so slowly and in just the right way and with industry on board, what we actually saw was it made about 250 million a year. Because the drinks industry had implemented the outcomes. It's why fizzy drinks are more expensive now. But on the flip side of that, it saved the NHS hundreds of millions. So it's got multiple victories. When we look at plastic bag tax, for example, the way that was done was that we'll tax plastic bags, we'll start at 5p, and then we'll increase to a loss aversion rate. So most people will drop off at 5p. And then as we increase, more and more people will stop using them. As a result of that, that raises, again, about 200 million a year for charities. It allows the government to direct that money to certain places. And I believe supermarkets now do that directly. But it allows them to target community support and find regional ways of investing that capital for something that fundamentally shouldn't be used. So we managed to achieve an environmental behavior of not using plastic bags. We also then raise money for the local environment, and may that be community trusts, etc. And as a result, that again is a perfect example of discouraging a bad environmental and nature behavior and creating a revenue positive outcome. There are lots of other ways to do that as well. There is, for example, the low traffic neighborhoods policies, I know that is highly contested, and I'm kind of wishing I hadn't brought it up now. But low traffic neighborhood policies are incredibly cheap to implement, and they fundamentally, more often than not, one of the tricks to that was to don't use giant concrete barriers, use planters, because they weigh the same. All you've got to do is get weighted street furniture in the way to stop the passage of traffic, and in doing so you make the streets safer for children, you make the streets safer for disabled people and blind people, and you also lower the amount of toxicity in that area, and you stop cut-throughs, you stop traffic. But most significantly, people use their cars less, which drives them onto public transport, which actually begins to fund public transport better, which leads to more access to public transport and more services on public transport, which then apparently, there's a 1.7% turnaround on that. So effectively, 1.7 ROAS on that. So effectively, ROI. You can tell I'm an ad man. So your ROI, your return on investment for doing that, is 1.7 times. It's a cumulative multiplier caused by the fact that as people start to use public transport, they pay for that, which means greater service need, which means greater investment, which leads to greater availability, which then, as a result of that, leads to more people using public transport. Ridiculously, encouraging people to use public transport in itself results in more people using public transport. And that's a perfect example of revenue neutral. Something like, because most public transport in this country is subsidised by the government. Well, it certainly will be when Labour nationalise the railways, which, to be honest, if you can't, the economic argument there is always, if you can't have multiple suppliers and there's only one point of supply for every household, then you can't have a regulated market, because there's no market competition. The gas you get through your pipe is just the same every time. Or, for example, the train that turns up is always the same. Anyway, sorry, economics argument there. But trains are a great example of that. By pushing people out of their cars for something like low traffic neighborhoods, we encourage the usage of buses, etc., trains, public transport in general, and as a result of that, we lower the number of cars on the road, near enough permanently as well. So something as simple as some planters full of soil becomes greater public transport, and being able to track that is possible and viable. And as a result of that, we can prove that investing in low traffic neighborhoods results in greater public transport usage, and that linkage means more low traffic neighborhoods. It's actually slightly more effective than taxing people for it, like we see in the ULEZ area.
So one of the big priorities for campaigners, campaigning organisations, public affairs teams at the moment is obviously going to be getting out and building relationships with all the new MPs. And like you said, a really kind of key window of opportunity to do that right now. And obviously for bigger organisations that have supporter bases in different constituencies, they can leverage those supporter bases to get those meetings, to get in and make that happen, and to put that narrative across to them. One of the things that we're seeing in the sector, in the echo chamber, is a lot of call for pay rise for nature. You mentioned as one of the kind of campaigning asks, more space for nature, and lots of things kind of relating to or having an impact on farming communities. And we're also seeing that in ocean campaigning. A lot of the asks have direct implications for the fishing communities. But what I'm noticing at the moment is there's not a lot of active stakeholder engagement with those communities that are going to be affected. And that was one of the key arguments in our discussion around Just Stop Oil and how to win an election, because actually when you overlay a map of deprivation in this country to a map of where the oil and gas kind of heartlands are, it's direct link. And actually those oil and gas jobs are the highest paid jobs in those areas. They are uplifting those communities. So we need to be justly transitioning them and utilizing those skills in green energy and in renewables and in those jobs. It's not practical to say just stop oil immediately without having a transition plan in place that doesn't leave those communities behind. So a big part of the stakeholder engagement in this needs to be thinking about the communities that are directly affected. And obviously that was a kind of key part of what you were saying throughout, really, Andrew, around making the economic argument, was showing how it affects everyday working people, communities, and people's wallets, and framing it around the cost of living. I didn't actually have a question there, did I? Just making a point.
I completely agree with you. And what I'd say there, picking up on the fishermen and the farmers, is the Labour Party will not mess with fishermen and farmers. One, because the Tories did that already and it went really, really badly. And two, because fundamentally, fishermen and farmers feed this country. You're right, they're in the most deprived communities. They are the people that make us able to eat, and they fill your supermarket shelves. They work every day and they work damn hard. They are the working people that Keir Starmer is talking about. And the availability of cheap food is key to getting inflation under control. So, because we've all seen the supermarket price rises. I mean, they are 12 to 15% in supermarkets. So keeping food cheap is important. But from an environmental perspective, 30 by 30, farmers hate it. They absolutely hate it. But putting in protected areas for fishing, fishermen hate it because nobody's actually going out and talking to them and saying, right, okay, how does this work for you on the ground? If you want to protect nature and get 30 by 30, don't do what the Welsh government did and demand that rented farms turn 30% of their land over to trees, because that will bankrupt those farms. It's why farmers are protesting in Wales, because they are going to go bankrupt. It's that simple. What we have to do instead is go talk to those farmers and say to them, right, we want to protect 30% of land in this country. We'd really like your help with that. You also desperately need greater subsidies to be able to function, because fundamentally farming doesn't make any money anymore. And most farmers are on the breadline. I mean, you want to talk about food banks, you go to a farming community. It's bad. It's really, really bad. We go out and we do a lot of work in this space. The sector needs to go out and talk to the farmers about how it works for them, get the farmers on board, and there will be a way to get to 30 to 30. The farmers will quite happily hand over land. They'll quite happily steward their land to the best they can. That's what farmers do. It's fundamentally what those families have been doing for thousands of years. I mean, but we have to engage those communities. We have to make it work for those communities. But also in engaging those communities, we can find ways to do it that help. If we're pulling from farm subsidy budgets, then it's revenue neutral, because the government is going to have to subsidize farmers one way or another. We just got to decide what we subsidize them on. So let's work out what works for farmers. Let's talk to them and engage them. Let's work out what works for fishermen to keep the fishing fleets, especially post-Brexit, and the rules around category B fish and shellfish. That's the word. Category B shellfish. Let's not be shellfish about it. Let's make it work for the industries. Instead of saying we must do this, let's engage them. Tell you what, you get all the farmers on board. The quickest way to a Labour win for a policy will be get those farmers on board, get those fishermen on board. Do you think the Labour Party wouldn't absolutely adore a solution to the fact that the fishing industry in this country is fundamentally broken and was fundamentally broken by the Conservative Party in the 80s? That is a huge political victory. We have to help the Labour Party play the political game. We have to help the government play that game as well as they can. And the better we help them, the more they are able to achieve. And so farm subsidies, great. Let's talk about farmers. Let's talk about engaging those communities. Let's talk to them about how the subsidies need to work for them and about what their land is capable of doing, because every farm is different. Let's talk about how it works on the ground and then have that discussion and take an actual practicable solution to the government and say, we have support of farmers, we have support of the NFU. That is the key to winning it. You get the support of the NFU, you'll protect 30% of land. Instead, farmers are protesting in Wales. And on fishermen, the same applies. I think we've got an actual question.
You can tell when Andrew has been up all night when the dad jokes come out, but hopefully our friends at Ocean Saver will enjoy that one. So great point and question here from Char, that gas and oil are clearly bad for the environment. I saw that in recent years, renewable energy has taken over as the main use provider. Does renewable energy make more money for the government / could it? Why are they hesitant to push this compared to gas and oil? It seems it's only policies to get people to vote for them rather than actually make plans for more wind farms, etc.
It's interesting that you should say that, because it's not that the government wants to, whatever government it may be, wants to push gas and oil. It's a staged stage fail out, for want of a better word. So coal has gone, for example. There's one plant left and it's about to be closed down because it's just not cost effective to run anymore. But the problem is that fundamentally gas and oil are reliable. And from a government perspective, if I was in the civil service again, and that's what you'd be hearing out the Department for Energy Security, is you'd be hearing gas and oil are reliable. Wind only works when the wind blows. So the problem there isn't that the government doesn't want more wind. There is piles of it queued up, lots and lots and lots queued up. And actually the Labour Party is doing exactly what it needs to bring down bills and make it work and make it profitable for the government as well by founding GB Energy. Because fundamentally the problem with energy right now isn't that we don't have enough wind, it's that we can't connect the farms that are privately funded to the grid fast enough. And the grid is nearly 10 years behind. So they're building entire offshore wind turbine farms that take years to get connected to the grid. On top of which, the honest truth is, the reason we talk about gas and oil and that the government talks about gas and oil is because talking about nuclear is incredibly unpopular. The actual answer to removing gas and oil is micro nuclear reactors built by Rolls-Royce, who know how to do it and have done it for years because they build our nuclear submarines. Again, that works for Rolls-Royce. It will make Rolls-Royce money. It will also cheapen the cost of electricity in this country, and it will fundamentally guarantee supply going forward rather than trying to build giant nuclear plants. That David Cameron announced he'd build one of those, and the first week he came into government, and they still haven't finished the foundations yet. So these giant projects aren't working. So in terms of gas and oil, it is a legacy industry. The government sees it as a legacy industry. However, it has to be phased out because of those jobs, etc., that Sean was talking about earlier, those actual people's lives in those giantly deprived communities. There's also a really annoying thing that where the oil is just happens to not be the best place to build wind farms. So it's not, they can't swap one for the other, but that actually is why the government is so absolutely obsessed with this carbon capture stuff, because that's how you replace oil jobs. It's how, because you've got the hole, the technology is fundamentally not particularly different, and most of it is off the shelf from the oil industry anyway. So that is why that's so important, and it's one of the reasons why that gets forgotten about by the environmental sector, but actually is a key proponent to ending oil and gas, is giving those people other jobs. Otherwise we end up with what happened in the 80s and the miners. But coming back to your question, yes, renewable energy is definitely getting there as the main provider. If the national grid can keep up, I would lay money that the government will nationalise the national grid at some point again. Don't really understand why it was ever put into private hands in the first place. Does renewable energy make more money? Yes and no is the answer there. I would recommend following a chap on LinkedIn called Nye Gordon. He's the specialist in energy. Absolutely brilliant chap of, I can't remember. Guidehouse, that's it. He's absolutely fabulous. And he talks about this stuff far more succinctly than I do. I'm literally just parroting what he told me at the climate lobby board meeting the other day, but well worth following. But yes, fundamentally over time, wind turbines last forever, and you can take them apart and put them back together, and fundamentally overall they don't have that many moving parts. Long term you get cheaper energy, but it's the initial investment that's the problem. But a lot of that is being done by the private sector. If somebody can pitch the national grid, which is Labour policy, so let's pray. Why are they hesitant to push it? I'll round off by saying they're not hesitant. It is literally a case of the infrastructure won't cope with it. We were talking to an engineer the other day who pointed out that every school in the country wants solar panels on their roof, but actually, if you do that in summer when they're most usable, the grid isn't capable of taking all that energy. And as a result, that energy goes to waste because the grid isn't capable of handling it, because it's a localized grid. Proper power stations are run off separate wires to what you get in the ground down your street. They're high voltage, low voltage differentials. It seems it's only policies to get people's votes from them rather than actually making plans. That is an interesting one. You're absolutely right on wind farms. The reason they're all offshore is because the NIMBYs wouldn't let them be built onshore. But it turns out that in doing that, it's been really, really effective at building wind farms. And Britain has the world's first, second, and third largest wind farms, I believe. But yeah, if you can prioritize how it works for voters, that is not a bad thing. If it will work and you get to the outcome and you take voters along with you, then you get to stay in government. That's fundamentally what the Conservatives forgot for the last 3 years. And it's fundamentally what Keir Starmer is going to lie awake at night worrying about, or at least his strategy guys are. Did I waffle there, Sean, or did I answer that?
Sense. Thank you. Thanks for your question, Char. If anyone else has any questions, we will round off very shortly because we are over time, but it's been a really fantastic discussion. I have one more question, if I may, Andrew.
I've now talked for an hour and 11 minutes, so...
I know, bless you. You have been awake all night, and we really appreciate your time and expertise. But just to kind of round us off and bring together some of the core themes that you have discussed all the way through and that we've been really pushing for the last year and a bit, as we've seen kind of climate, nature, but really particularly the cost of getting to net zero become a wedge issue. And obviously a lot of anger within our sector around the lack of action, the lack of speed, the rolling back on things. But often that anger, that frustration, and the fact that it is a wedge issue becomes more banging the environmental drum, more trying to get people engaged in the why, that moral imperative that I talked about earlier, the fact that this is something that we have to do, the climate emergency narrative, and not actually getting the cut through in the places that matter and presenting a counter argument. And actually we wrote quite a strong opinion piece a while ago now that climate campaigners are failing the planet because they are failing to make that jump from moral imperative argument to economic argument, and they're failing to make that economic and that business case that actually gets the people with the power to drive change to prioritize that and to do that. And we have really seen that play out in this election. The fact that the manifestos to varying degrees all had some level of promise, some level of rhetoric around net zero, climate, not so much nature, but no really specific tangible points that could be immediately turned into policy, even from Labour. So there's a big job ahead for the sector now to take those fairly wishy-washy promises, for want of a better phrase, and turn them into policy asks. And we're going to be doing that in an environment where fundamentally major losses on the right, but also a big split on the right. And like you said, that risk that alliances are formed there and, within parties that have a tendency to really leverage this as a wedge issue. So this is a completely new environment for campaigners and is a completely different way of campaigning going forward. What would be your final piece of advice to the people that have watched this session, taken in all of this wonderful information that you've shared? You know, they need to act fast. They need to build those stakeholder relationships in government and outside of government with the communities that are affected. They need to reframe their narrative. What is the one piece of advice you would give anybody watching this who is going to go away from their desk and go, right, this is what I'm going to do next?
That's simple. As of 05/19 this morning, you cannot demand a policy change that is going to cost voters money. This is how we got in this mess. It's how it dropped down the agenda. We put vast quantities of expense on people's bills. Like 20% of bills, energy bills, is actually net zero one way or another. Same with water, especially in London with the giant super sewer. So yeah, we have to make this work for the individual on the ground and working people. This sector has fundamentally not remembered that the people at the core of saving the planet also have to be able to feed themselves. And we have to get to a point where what we're talking about works for the individual. It works for the working class families on 15 bloody quid an hour who can't afford that extra tax, that can't afford to feed their families, let alone anything else. I grew up in one of those families, and honestly, we need to get rid of the middle class bias, and we need to say, how do we tell the Labour Party that this policy will work and it either won't cost them anything or it will improve something? And not just the environment is this giant thing. It has to be related to how people are feeling. The reason the Tories lost is because they stopped paying attention to how real people on minimum wage actually feel. And the Labour Party today and from now on, their primary concern is how to avoid doing exactly the same thing. So that's it. That's my one thing. My one thing is fundamentally lose the middle class bias, make it about the average working person, and whenever you're designing policy, make it cost neutral or prove the value to the communities it will happen in. Local, regional value. Prove that it's not an expense, and if the sector can, stop designing policy that demands the government to spend vast quantities of money it just doesn't have. And let's start talking to the government about what money it does have and what difference we can make. Because right now we're getting no policy change, because you're absolutely right, Sean. Fundamentally, the manifestos were near bereft. I mean, actually, weirdly, and this is a very funny fact, the Liberal Democrats had more on climate than the Green Party, who beat the Liberal Democrats on nature. But actually, the Liberal Democrat manifesto had more on climate, and I got that from one of the Friends of the Earth, I think. That's where we are. That there's only even the Green Party aren't talking about climate because we've made it's so unpopular because everybody just wants to be able to feed their family. So let's start designing policy that really works. Let's start making reasonable and scalable asks. I come back to the peatland thing and just say, you want 100,000 hectares of peatland? Let's get in there. Let's talk about how that's done on the ground. Let's talk to farmers. Let's talk to the departments. Let's find a way to have it included as a solution rather than a cost. And that is it. Fundamentally, we need to move to solutions, not costs.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So in the comments on LinkedIn, you will find a link to subscribe to our regular insights via email. And you will also find a discovery call link if you are working on a campaign and you would like help delving into that narrative, making the economic argument, or just talking about your next steps, your stakeholder engagement and how to plan that out. You can book in with myself and Andrew from next week. A massive, massive thank you to Andrew and all of our team at 181st Street who have been up all night doing some fantastic analysis, pulling all of this together. They've worked incredibly hard. We are so, so grateful to all of them. So thank you very much. And to everybody who tuned in and watched, do make sure you follow us on social media. We will be back with more lunch and learns and live briefings very, very soon. Have a great weekend, everybody, and we will speak to you soon.